You can always make more money, but you can't make more time. That's a quote that's been on my mind a lot lately. Welcome back to the show. I'm Paul Schmid, the host of The Pursuit Zone, a podcast that interviews explorers from around the globe to bring you their exciting stories. These are people that dream big, break out of their comfort zones, and take on ambitious pursuits. This is episode 176 with Alison Young. In this episode, we talk about her thru-hike of Te Araroa in New Zealand. Alison has been on the show before. She was in episode 159 where she talked about her trek to K2 Base Camp back in the 90s. You can find that episode on thepursuitzone.com/TPZ159. Let's start the show and let me introduce Alison. In late October 2018, she traveled to New Zealand to begin a 4-month southbound thru-hike of Te Araroa, a 3,000-kilometer walking track across the North and South Islands. It's a challenging hike that took her across various landscapes, including beaches, cities, forests, and volcanoes. You can read more about Te Araroa and her other adventures at her website, blissfulhiker.com. Alison Young, welcome back to the show.
Thanks so much for having me on it, Paul.
Well, I was surprised when you contacted me about Te Araroa because I went back and I listened to the end of our last episode together, which is about a year ago now.
Yeah.
And you said that you were off to do the coast to coast in the UK. And so I was surprised to hear about this new adventure. I'm kind of curious of how the idea was hatched. Was it on that coast-to-coast walk?
No, it was actually a few years before that. I mean, I'd always had an interest in doing a long-distance thru-hike, kind of the sort of scope of the Pacific Crest Trail or the Appalachian Trail. I'd been working, so you'd have to take the kind of time to do something like that, end to end. So I asked for a leave of absence and I kind of worked on it over a couple of years from my position. And they finally agreed to it. They allowed me to take the time to walk it because I really wanted to see what it felt like to do, the whole thing at once. I've done like all of the Superior Hiking Trail, but I did it over, many different years and different visits up there. So this was kind of a chance to kind of experience physically and emotionally what it would be like to walk an entire trail end to end. Pretty much, obviously I took 0 days, but without stopping.
How much planning did you have to do before you set out?
Now, it took a couple of years to do that. I mean, you have to read other people's blogs, and you go to the website that they have. There's a Te Araroa Association that's pretty thorough. So they have trail notes and suggestions and maps and, kind of the works. It's a lot of doing that. But because I'd never gone on a thru hike before, there was kind of that whole zeitgeist to digest, sort of the idea of what you can take on your back, what you can really realistically expect to buy there and get as you go, and what things you really need to take. And I think that was kind of specific for a place like New Zealand because while there is a lot available, I mean, it's a wonderful country and there's a lot of outdoors activity. So, you can pretty much get anything you want. It's a small country and it's far from things. So to get like the exact pair of shoes, that was my primary thing. The exact pair of shoes that you'd want when you wore out your shoes could be a problem. So what I did was called a bounce box, and you put things in it that you sort of bounce ahead of you. So I sent it first to Auckland, and then I sent it from Auckland to Wellington, and then I sent it from Wellington to Wanaka, and then I sent it from Wanaka to Invercargill, and that was pretty much the end of it. So I had things in it that I thought I might not find there that I really like. That kind of stuff takes a lot of planning and also kind of faith too, because you have this idea that you're going to be perfect in your planning. Everything you've decided to take is going to be exactly what you need. And you send it off, and then of course you get there and you find certain things didn't quite work as well and stuff like that. So there's a little bit of flexibility involved and faith as well.
Does the bounce box also include food you would need?
No, I didn't send food ahead because food is pretty available everywhere. Where I did send what we call resupply, it's a little bit different. I mean, a bounce box is something that's kind of literally bouncing ahead of you. So you might put something in it that you think you need later or take something out of it that you need now. A resupply is a box of food that goes to like a very specific location. New Zealand really only had 3 places that you would do that. They're all one after another. And it's at the north part of the South Island. But you could not do that. You could you could get to the place where you hit a road and you could hitchhike to a town. But I found it really, really smart to do that because then I could just pick up my box pretty much where I was and just keep walking, just keep going. And it helped me out a lot. So I did that just in those 3 places. Everywhere else, I was just able to buy food.
Is their postal service difficult to figure out?
Yeah, a little bit. In this case, I actually sent there were like ski resorts. One place was kind of an outdoor center, an outdoors pursuit center kind of place. And so that was really easy. Oh, and the other place was the DOC, the Department of Conservation, sort of their headquarters. I mean, one of the problems of sending anything is, of course, you have to know the hours. So, sometimes you're like running to get there because you don't want to spend an entire weekend. You don't want to lose all that time walking if you miss the hours. So you sort of need to be aware of that. But people who send a lot of stuff by postal, it is a different system from ours. And the way that they hold stuff for you is kind of complicated. I didn't end up using any of that. They also don't deliver every single day. I mean, we don't either, but I mean, even fewer days than the United States. So there was a little bit of complication to that. But I think, if someone's listening to this and thinking of doing the Te Araroa, you probably don't really need to be too concerned about sending too many boxes, the way you probably would do more on something like the PCT.
What do you need for a visa?
Oh, the visa was a pretty interesting experience because it took me 4 months and I actually went to the country for not quite 5.5 months. You need a longer visa. I think you can only get a 3-month, just kind of a general one for travel. So you have to apply for that. They asked a lot of probing questions. I mean, they wanted proof that I was returning to a job. They wanted a copy of my marriage certificate. They wanted a copy of my bank statements. I mean, essentially, they're trying to keep people from just coming to the country and disappearing in it, I imagine. But the other thing that made it a little awkward was that they wanted a copy of my return ticket. So I needed to buy a plane ticket before I applied for a visa, which was, talk about operating on faith. I assumed they weren't going to say, no, you can't come after I'd bought a plane ticket. But that was a little odd. It actually didn't take as long as I thought, probably because I was just really careful. They gave you a chance to write, you can write a little note that explains what you're doing. So the immigration people are probably getting fairly used to travelers who come for longer periods to do something like a hike. Of course, New Zealand has a really special program for people 30 and under, where they can work and have a holiday at the same time. It's a special kind of visa. I think it's a year and then you reapply. I don't exactly know because I'm in my 50s, but they actually encourage a lot of people to come there for a good amount of time. So I felt very welcomed, but I did have to have a very, very thorough visa. So again, if you want to do the Te Araroa, I would plan well ahead to get that visa taken care of.
So you flew into Auckland?
I flew into Auckland and then I took a puddle hopper or whatever to Kayaking. They pronounce it Kitty Kitty, which is in Northland. And I met a woman on Facebook who picked me up and hooked up with me. And that's really kind of one of the cool things, first of all, about having social media now. I mean, I think it makes the whole thing of backpacking and through hiking so much easier. I mean, you can communicate with people, you can meet people, you can get your hiking partner and all that. But she lives in Hamilton and she went up, her dad and stepmom picked her up. They just went ahead and got me too at the airport and drove us all the way up to Cape Ringa, which is pretty far. It's about a 2-hour drive from there and it's fairly remote. People find that portion of planning the trip a little bit complicated because there are buses, but they're more tour buses. So you end up stopping and seeing stuff. And you're kind of I just want to start my trail, and also they go out on the 90-mile beach. So you sort of see what you're about to walk on. That kind of spoils it a little bit. Fortunately, I had that ride with her. Irene is a Kiwi, as I mentioned. She's from Hamilton, and actually right now she's hiking the Pacific Crest Trail in our country. But she was just doing sections, so she hiked with me just the first 8 days. And I have to say that was one of the most cherished memories of the whole experience, was to meet a Kiwi right from the start, have a ride up there, which of course it saved me money and it saved me time and all of that. But it was also this wonderful, beautiful introduction to the people and to the country and just to the kind of vibe. And then I had someone to hike with for 8 days, and those were hard days.
Did you end up hiking most of it solo or with a group? Because it kind of seems from looking through your blog that you picked up a little bit of a trail family along the way.
Yeah, a small trail family part of the time. I would say it's a different experience, and maybe this was just a New Zealand thing. I don't know, but to be a middle-aged woman hiking alone, you don't always hook up with people. It seemed to me on this trip that it was a lot of, younger people finding each other, and then, they have lifelong partners from the trip. And I would kind of be alone a lot of the time. So I would meet people and I would kind of be with them for a little bit, and then we would part. So I would say I did the North Island almost completely solo, except for those days with Irene, and then a couple of isolated incidences. Of course, the Whanganui River, I was with a partner the whole time. And then on the South Island, it was quite a different experience. I met people in the ranges, and that's when it got kind of difficult. You had rivers to cross, and you had some dangerous country to go through. So it started as 7, and then it went down to 3, and then it was just 2, and then it was just 1 again. But I hiked with that group for a while because it was just much safer to do that.
So on the North Island, how much of it is road walking?
Oh, that's a really good question. I mean, I think the facts give a specific number, and sometimes people say, it's 40% or something. That was not really my experience. I guess it depends on what you call a road, because sometimes you're walking on like forest roads or really super rural country roads, and they don't feel like you're on a road. I would characterize road walking as when you have cars, a lot of cars coming at you. There were a couple of places that felt unpleasant and a little dangerous, where you didn't have much shoulder or verge, I guess is what they call it there. That's very typical of New Zealand. The roads are very narrow and windy, and there's very little room to walk. And there's also, kind of an education campaign going on now to help motorists understand that the walkers belong there and that they have to share the road. This is still a very alien concept to New Zealand drivers. And actually, it's a bit awkward. It was a lesson for me. They don't stop for pedestrians. Pedestrians don't have the right of way the way they do in the United States or in Europe, except in very specific crosswalks. And that's kind of a problem because it is pretty unsafe. I think last summer in the hiking season, there was one person hit by a car. I mean, not badly hurt, just, shaken up. And I had a few little bit run-ins with people just seeming really aggressive. So that is a bit of an issue right now. Those places, the worst places in the North Island was between Whanganui and Palmerston North. But apparently they've taken the trail off of the roads. So they're making the trail go in a much more on back roads. So I guess you'd still consider it road, but it's a different kind of road. It's not like a major throughway. One other thing I want to mention about the roads that's kind of shocking too when you get there is that except for in the big cities, everything's just 2 lane. There's 1 lane going and 1 lane coming. And that includes really large trucks. And they drive these giant trucks that have like 2 carriages on them. I think I'm using the right word. They also have a second trailer. So they're enormous. Of course, they were the coolest people of all. They really know how to drive those trucks, and they're right on the road. But you did feel like you had to pay attention. And, I would never use headphones or, be talking on my phone or doing anything like that. I really concentrated when I was on the road. But it is a little bit disconcerting. Part of the issue with the Te Araroa is it's only 7 years old now, 8 years old. It's really a new trail. As some of my friends have pointed out, it's not a trail. It's not a route. It's more of an idea. And so in those areas, they're still trying to figure out where to put walkers. For instance, you might be on, quote unquote road walking, but you're in certain areas, they're trying to build a sidewalk, or they're trying to build, a dirt path that bikes can use as well. So, efforts are being made to make it more palatable, but that's really the only way you can get from some sections to other sections.
Did you do any hitchhiking?
Barely any. I was what they called a purist, which I found actually a little bit offensive, because it's like, well, actually, I'm a through hiker. And then they'd find that offensive. Some people cut off about 500 to 700 kilometers hitchhiking. Then they'd get to the end and they'd say, wow, I did 3,000 kilometers. And I thought, no, not exactly. I walked it all. The hitchhiking that I did was to get from the end of the trail to town, which everybody has to do, like on the PCT and the AT and other places, because you don't cross right through towns. And in one really unpleasant section where in the South Island, where the trail was near Tiano, the trail was just in terrible shape, and you were going to be on a dirt road for 30 kilometers. And I thought, that's too much. I mean, I can't even walk that much. Well, I can walk it in a day, but it was, it's just a misery. You're out in the sun. So I did hitch there. But essentially, no, I walked it.
How were the river crossings?
Dangerous. When you're in the North Island, you feel like you've gone through a lot of rivers, and you kind of get the idea of what rapids feel like and rising water. But it's nothing compared to what you experience in the South Island. I think we probably have these kinds of rivers in places like in Alaska and the Yukon. I don't know if we have them out west in the contiguous United States, but they're called braided rivers, where you have like an enormous riverbed, like 10 kilometers across or something. I mean, maybe I'm exaggerating that, because we crossed one that was almost that size, but we were maybe going at a diagonal. So maybe we could picture like 6 kilometers across, and it's a rocky riverbed, and it's not all water. The water is in different braids coming down, and so you're crossing it multiple times. And sometimes you're in something that's deep and sort of fast moving, but it's not really the main part of the river, and it's sort of brownish water because it's sort of off the main piece. And sometimes you're crossing stuff that has some quicksand in it, and that's pretty dangerous. I mean, you're probably not going to sink to your death. It's not like the movies, but you're going to get stuck, and you have to throw your pack off, and you got to be really careful of that. And in other places, you get to that really blue kind of silty water. It's gorgeous. It's glacial water, and it's moving fast. You can't see the bottom, and it's terrifying. And rivers are extremely dangerous. They're deadly in New Zealand. So I crossed one. I crossed the Araroa by myself, but there had been a lot of people crossing it coming the other way, so I kind of just knew I'd be okay if I was careful. But you have to use really smart river crossing technique. A lot of people take classes to do that, and they practice. Just kind of the way that you place your body, the way you look for the fall line, and also if it's too deep, the way you link arms. You unhitch a certain part of your backpack, and you put your arms underneath the other person's backpack, and you all walk like crabs across. The idea is that in numbers, you can kind of keep each other upright. But they were very dangerous, very fast moving, cold, and in many cases, not for me, I was lucky. Rain would come, and people that were one day behind me had to skip entire sections because the water would rise really fast, and it was just impassable. So you'd either have to wait a few days, or you just had to skip it and, try to hitchhike out. I want to add one more thing to the rivers. That was probably the most badass thing of the whole trail. It's the part that was new to me, like something I'd never done before. And I was really scared of them. And I got better at it. And so by the time I got to the Araroa, which is the largest river crossing that's officially on the Te Araroa, and I did it by myself, I just felt so strong and so good. And, you just really are careful. I would suggest that anybody who does this hike use walking sticks and not try to do it without them. Not only because of the river crossings, it just makes it safer, and you can find the depth of things. New Zealand, they don't call it hiking and they don't call it trekking. They call it tramping. And tramping elicits this idea of extremely difficult walking. And that is how I would describe New Zealand. The trails are almost non-existent in a lot of places. And they're bush bashing, and they're extremely steep, both up and down. So you need walking sticks, and you need strong knees, and you need to know that it's not the kind of trails we have in the U.S. I complained about it a lot, But now I feel like super proud, right? Because I did it.
How well is the trail marked?
Oh man. In some places it's a problem because you're in high grass that they call tussock. There'll be a pole like way out somewhere, in the direction you need to go. And it has like a little tiny, maybe about a 4-inch orange mark on top of it. And it's bright orange. And you're looking for it, but the grass has grown over it. So you can't always see them. And I found those really awkward to find. They also use orange triangles. Now I feel like tenderness for them, but you're always looking for them. They put them on the trees. But a lot of times you can't see the trail because of mud, because of blowdown, and you're really scanning to find where those orange triangles are. But I have to say that it's either the TA association or DOC, depending on which part of the land it's on, or it's the local club, tramping clubs. People have made a huge effort to mark the trail well. I used a GPS, an app called Gut Hook, and that helped me because sometimes when I get off trail, you'd have to be pretty far off trail, and then you'd be like, oh, I'm going the wrong way. And you could find your way back. There were times when I had a lot of expletives coming out of my mouth, trying to find the marker. And there you are, you're pretty much alone. No one can hear you. And who are you complaining to? You're complaining to the birds. But eventually I found my way.
What are you doing for drinking water?
Well, I used a Sawyer squeeze. It's only weighs about 1.5 ounces or I think something like that. It's just a little purifier that you screw on your water bottle. I mean, I take commercial water bottles. I don't use the Sawyer water bottles because they tend to break. So I use like a Coke bottle. Screw it on that, fill it up and then squeeze it into another container. I'm trying to remember if I ever had trouble with water. The place is basically really wet. So there were, I think in the Richmond Range, that was one of the places. So it's a pretty remote area in the north of the South Island. You're warned. I mean, it's in your notes and people write about it into the apps and they talk about it. You have to have enough water to go for 20K or something like that. So you just need to make sure you have enough. And, the term people use in thru-hiking is to camel up. Like before you start the section, you just drink as much water as you possibly can get in you. And then you carry as much water as you can carry. And you usually are just fine. But there's streams everywhere. So I didn't have any problem with that. And also I should say that at the huts, they collect water into rain barrels, which is really, really smart because, it's free. I mean, you don't have to pump anything. Some people felt a little nervous drinking that. I cleaned it some of the times, and then sometimes I didn't, and I think it's perfectly fine. I never got sick.
Well, you were on the North Island for 70 days, and I saw some of the photographs, and it looked pretty wet, pretty muddy. What kind of...
Epically.
Is that normal for that time of year?
Oh, yeah, it's normal. I mean, of course, every year has, its particular character. I mean, I was told by a lot of people that they'd had a pretty serious drought in 17-18, but 18-19 was a particularly wet year in that time that I was there. After I left, as I started to move south, they actually had fires in some of the north part of the South Island, so it really dried out. Did you ever see the movie The Piano?
Yes. And
do you remember how they walked through the mud and all the rain and just that like constant in the depth of the mud? I mean, I remember seeing that film and there's so much in that's incredibly sensual, right? But I just remember that particular scene thinking, my God, I mean, is it really like that? Or is that just because, they're farming and there's no development? No, it's really like that. Mud is up to your knees in some places. It slows your pace, of course, but it's also it's just filthy and it's just impossible. And there's no way to get around it. You kind of have to go straight through it. And as one of my Kiwi friends said, you have to embrace the mud. I first experienced it on day 5 when I went through the Ratea forest. And unfortunately, the Northland forests are having a pretty serious issue with Kauri dieback. It's a kind of fungus that's killing their very, very beautiful tall trees. They're kind of like our redwoods. I mean, they have these beautiful trees and it's killing them. So they're keeping people out of the forests now, which is really a shame because it's definitely a shame that those trees are dying, but it's a shame that the TA hikers can't experience the forest because they're very special. But I was able to walk through the Ratea forest, and it's only about 20K or something. It's really not that far. But we were going kind of a leisurely pace because we didn't think much of it. It was a beautiful day, and there was so much mud. And then we found ourselves trapped in there. I mean, we couldn't get out. And darkness was going to fall at about 7. So we were pushing it because we knew that there was one tiny grassy place coming up where we could camp. And we were like, going through all this mud and pushing ourselves through. And it's up and down. It's like super steep. And finally, we saw it. It was like, oh, there it is. But there's no water up there. So we just had whatever we had to drink in our water bottles. And so you couldn't get the mud off of you before you went into your tent and in your sleeping bag, So I had, wet wipes. I had like a packet of them. And since it was only day 5, I still had a full packet of them. And I just used them and like washed off as much as I could. I mean, it was a really dirty business. But by the time I got sort of more into the sort of central part of the North Island in the Waikato, that's when I'd had it up to my, had it up to here kind of. I was just getting impatient with the mud. It was raining so much and there was so much mud. And you were more in farmland. I mean, it was beautiful in a certain way. It was like big puffy clouds and these kind of beautiful rolling landscapes. But it was just so slippery, and I fell a couple of times, and I got pretty impatient with it. So when you finally came out of that, you appreciated beautiful weather like you'd never appreciated it before.
My understanding on the North Island, there's some sort of a big kayaking trip or a canoeing trip that you have to do. Tell me about that.
Oh, so what's really cool about the Te Araroa is you are propelling yourself on your own steam, but you can't, I suppose you could walk the whole thing. I mean, people can skip certain parts. In Northland, there's so many bays and so many estuaries that you do some kayaking. I mean, that's very short. I mean, I think it's just a couple of hours, maybe 3 hours max of kayaking. And that's pretty fun. And when you're at the Bay of Islands and you're kayaking in this absolutely gorgeous, like Caribbean blue water. It's just extraordinary. At about day 50, I think I arrived in Whakahoro. So what I did, this is basically what everyone does. You arrive in this town called Whanganui and you arrange for your canoe trip. And the canoe trip down the Whanganui River is considered a great walk. If you've ever heard of great walks, like the Milford Sound, or I should say the Milford, is it called? The Milford Track is one of the great walks, probably the most famous in the world. And Whanganui River is considered a great walk. Of course, you don't walk on it, you canoe it. And you can go for, I think, 7 days or something like that. I chose to just do 4.5 days. So what you do is you sort of set the whole thing up in Tauranui. They have outfitters there. And then you hike through the Tongariro and you finally arrive at Whakahoro, which is what I did. I didn't do 7 days, so I hiked that part, and then you canoe from there. And it was such a delight. It was such a cool thing to do. I mean, they're so organized. They're kind of like the Boundary Waters here in Minnesota. They have all the stuff you need. You have these big giant barrels, and you tie them in. They give you all the gear you need. And then you sort of trust, you fill the barrels with all this food, and they're going to like deliver it to you 4 days later or something as you're hiking in the Tongariro National Park, which is where there's active volcanoes. So, your mind is sort of split at this point. You're kind of like, okay, I got to go over the Tongariro Alpine Crossing, which is really dangerous if the weather's bad. So I'm trying to time it just right to make the weather. And, you're trying to get there. And it's one of the most spectacularly beautiful places, really in the world, but certainly in the North Island. But then your mind is sort of split that the next thing that you're going to be doing is this long canoe trip down a river. And you can't quite wrap your head around it. But anyway, so what I did was I got into Tauranui and I met these guys that I'd kind of met along the way, and we were all going to go together. I would have sort of had to go alone in a kayak with them they'd be two in a canoe. And along came this fella from Atlanta, a young American who just called in and said, "Is there anybody who wants to go with me?" And I was like, "Yeah, I'll go with you." And it was just so funny. Our birthdays were 2 days apart. We had them like right around that time. And he's exactly 30 years younger than I am. But Andrew and I totally connected. And I think the best part about it is he kind of understood how you read a river. It's a river with rapids. I don't think they're like seriously dangerous rapids, but they're rapids that a lot of people flip on. He knew how to guide us directly into them. And I was in the front, of course, because he's steering. But it's really scary. I mean, I've done a lot of boundary waters canoeing, but that's not, I mean, I suppose there's some rapids, but not like this. You're coming up upon them and you're in the front and you're looking at this thing and it is serious. You're going like straight in it. And in one of them, the biggest one, we went in and we took like a wave came like over me and filled up the canoe. And we just went right through. We didn't flip, but we had a canoe full of water. So we had to like very gently kind of rock to the side as he emptied out. I think he emptied out about like 25 gallons of water or something with our little scoop. But it's a really cool little piece of the whole thing. I mean, I know some people walk around it and don't do it, but it's so special and so unusual. And you camp along the way. I mean, you're right there on the river. We had this really interesting Maori experience where they did a special welcome for us. And I just met just lovely people. So it was a very special, really different thing because here you are kind of in your backpacking clothes and suddenly you're a paddler.
You know, going back to the budget thing, I bet.
Okay, so to pay for that, I mean, that's right. There are some things like that cost, a couple $100. And then on the South Island, I did a bicycle trip. So that cost, $130 or something to rent a bike. So yeah, I mean, some of that stuff kind of adds up.
But what I was going to mention too is that you're walking through cities, I believe, sometimes. And if you're going to spend a few days in a city, that's going to add up as well. And
I have friends.
That helps for sure.
I never stayed, I think like one night in a hostel. I made a lot of friends. Yeah, that helps. So yeah, I'm probably not giving a really good, accurate assessment of it. I had friends that I made and I had friends of friends and then there were trail angels. And I had some of the most extraordinary experiences with the people that hosted me. I visited Auckland, I visited Hamilton, I visited Wellington, Nelson, Wanaka, and Whanganui. Spent a good amount of time there too. Just that was such a lovely thing. And I mean, I know that Americans are very generous and welcoming, but there was a kind of spiritual piece to this too, because I think it's a Maori tradition to feel that we're all one. And we're all part of this earthly experience, and that hospitality is a piece of sharing, of that kind of way of looking at the world.
I was curious about when the trail intersects the cities, because my assumption is like, like let's take Wellington, for example. Does the trail just kind of go into Wellington and then you're into the city and then you find the trail again and walk your way back out? How does it work?
Yeah. Well, Wellington is the end of the North Island. So what I did was I walked into Wellington and I had friends there, friends of friends of friends, basically, that I visited. And then we walked some of it together because it's just the city. We went into the Botanic Gardens. You walk through that and went down kind of the main part along the water. And then you go up onto Victoria Hill and you start walking across all of these hills. That piece doesn't feel like you're walking down a city street. Auckland definitely felt like a city street. I mean, you're walking in the city. Then you kind of came out and there were some trails because Wellington feels a lot like San Francisco. Maybe Marin County would be a better example where you're suddenly going up and you're into the hills and you have trails, but then you come down and you're on a sidewalk again. But in a lot of places, even small towns, you had that sort of wonderful experience of being in the hills, coming down, and then hitting maybe a little tiny road or hitting a sidewalk, and then suddenly being at people's homes, and you're walking in a neighborhood, you're walking in the suburbs. And I found that really, really kind of sweet in a way. You have to get into the mindset for that because, if you're someone who's like a wilderness person, it might make you a little bit crazy. You're like, I'm walking on a sidewalk. That's probably why a lot of people hitchhike through all that stuff. But there was something kind of sweet about that because you started to see the way people really live and what the place really looks like and what's there. It's not just these beautiful places that are on postcards. It's also, people who just are living out their lives.
What were the temperatures that you had there?
Oh, yeah. Well, New Zealand's a pretty interesting place because there's no ozone. There's like a hole in the ozone. So anybody who goes there needs to be extremely careful of the sun. Wear sunscreen. I just keep cover up my whole body. I mean, I still got a little bit burned on my face, but when the sun is out, it can be really hot. I have a video on my website where I just completely come apart at the seams. I just start crying, and I went ahead and turned on my camera because I was just like, oh yeah, let's just show people what this is really like. It's not just always smiling, right? And part of the reason I had a breakdown is because I was really, really hot, and heat can just take it out of you. It can be exhausting. But the flip side of that in New Zealand is that when the sun would go behind a cloud, it could feel really cold fast. And the temperature extremes were strong. I never had snow per se. There was one place I walked through where there had been snow, and I sort of touched my feet on it and made a little snowball or something like that. It didn't fall on me, but I had hail, and I had really cold rain, and ice kind of blowing in my face. That kind of temperatures, very much like alpine regions. You may not be like super high, but because it's maritime, the weather is really changeable. And kind of one of the famous things they say about New Zealand is you can have all 4 seasons in like one day. You can just feel like all of them. That's the advantage of having huts on the South Island is, if you're really wet and you're freezing cold, you're not having to just warm up inside your tent. You can get inside a hut, and even if there's no fireplace or anything like that, you're automatically protected. But it can be pretty extreme. I took real rain gear, and I'd heard of some people who are ultralighters taking like very, very, kind of the skimpiest rain gear, and they had problems. I mean, they were just steps away from hypothermia. And I mean, I felt cold sometimes even when it was raining. But I had real rain gear, and I wore layers, and I just did kind of the wise stuff. Yeah, it can be extreme.
So what are we talking about? Like low 30s Fahrenheit?
Yeah, I wouldn't say low 30s. I would say the coldest I had might have gotten into the 40s, and the hottest was approaching 90s. And that's pretty rare for New Zealand. I mean, they were saying the heat wave was unusual. But, I'm sure global warming effects are affecting that country as well.
Did you end up with a preference of the North Island versus the South Island?
I loved the way I did the hike. I think it's the ultimate to go from the north all the way to the south. The south has kind of, the big views and the big alpine crossings and kind of the big rivers and, sort of the excitement and the intensity. There's some of that on the North Island with going in the Tongariro, but for the most part, it's gentler. So if you were a northbounder, it might feel a little bit like a very different experience. Maybe it's a little bit more of a letdown. You don't have quite the showy stuff. It's just different. Walking on the beaches, just extraordinary. I loved walking on the beaches, and I missed it once I got to the South Island. You didn't have them again until you got way, way down south. The way I would characterize them is in the North Island, you have a little bit more of a cultural experience. You meet more people, and you see more extremes of lifestyle. More Maori live on the North Island. That's where like the Treaty of the Waitangi was there, and so there's kind of more of that cultural piece up there. I had like more interchanges with people. And in the South Island, it was more just like I said, like sort of the big excitement of the mountains and stuff. So preference, I wouldn't say, but I would, if someone were only able to do a short piece of it, I mean, maybe the obvious answer would be to do the South. I would still vote for going from north to south to be a SOBO or southbounder.
Tell me a little bit more about this hut system. I saw in one photograph, it looked like you had a card that you got. Do you purchase this card so you can?
Oh, yeah. So you purchase a backcountry hut pass. This year it was $92. I don't know if they're raising it. That's about, I don't know, $70 or something like that. And as I mentioned to you, I stayed in 30 of them. So it's a deal. And I think that just pays for general maintenance, and caring for them. There's a real wide range of accommodation. Some of them were really large and slept a lot of people and had kind of, the separate rooms for where you slept from where the common area was. And some of them, just like the smallest one I was in only had 2 beds in it. Actually, I didn't stay in that one. I ended up coming in because it was the weather was turning a little bit, but they were taken. The two guys were in it, so I set my tent outside. But there's a little tiny one in the Tararuas. Oh, that's a place I didn't even mention. Oh my gosh, I can't believe I didn't say that. I don't know why I forgot about it. One of the most special places in the entire trip is the Tararua Mountains, which are just north of Wellington. And they're huge and they're exciting, and it's so different from the mountains of the South Island. It's the North Island. Very dangerous if the weather turns, though. So you have to really approach them carefully. And that was really some of the most beautiful pieces where I felt a lot of spiritual connection. So when you asked me the question earlier about what I preferred, I mean, in some ways, the Tararuas of the North Island were some of the best of the entire experience. But this particular hut was there, and it was just a 2-person hut, and it's so small, you couldn't like pass each other, getting into the bunks. There's just 2 bunks, and then there's like one long counter to work on. But, it's safe. You can't build a fire inside it. There's no way to make heat. But if the weather's just blowing, and really in the Tararuas, it's a place where if the weather comes in, you might not be able to leave for days. And so wouldn't you rather be inside a hut for days? You can make your food, you're out of the wind, you can play cards, you can just listen. And, I actually recorded sound because I also make these visual audio essays. And the sound of the wind on huts, it's just the whole thing is just rattling and shaking. And that's pretty exciting. So the hut system is incredible, but it's a real steal. And I know that some people wouldn't buy them because they kind of felt like it was supposed to just be free and just given to them. And that's really a shame. I encourage everybody to participate in the economy of New Zealand because they're offering this incredible system. You don't have to set up a tent where it could be potentially really dangerous.
How'd your gear work out for you?
Oh, my gear was amazing. I just made really good decisions. I've used a lot of stuff over the years. I think I just made a few changes to like a top. I decided to use a lighter shirt, but my tent was great. My poles, actually, that's kind of a funny story because I slipped in the Nelson Lakes National Park area, and I was coming down a really steep spot, and there was mud. And so, you sort of slip backwards. Your sticks don't really do anything for you. And I did this sort of fantastic tumble, and I fell right on top of them. And I thought, oh, I'm fine. I'm alive. No problems. And I pick up my stick, and it's like bent. And it looks kind of like Dizzy Gillespie. And I ended up still using it after that because I was really far from a place where I could get sticks. And then, they're kind of expensive, and they were fine. So I was really happy. I'll just give a shout out to Lecky. Love Lecky. So they really worked great. But yeah, stuff gets totally beat up. I use a quilt instead of a sleeping bag and loved that. Loved that whole idea of being able to kind of open it out and have your feet out if you want and not feel like you're inside a bag, but then tuck it in around you if you need to. My tent's very lightweight. Yeah, I mean, I did really well, but I have been kind of honing my gear for a lot of years.
And you had a tarp tent.
Yeah, I used tarp tent. That's a really great system because you have a tent inside a tarp, so you don't have any of that single wall kind of issue. Really, really important with rain. I just got, you get dumped with rain, of course, as you saw on the North Island. He seemed to just hold up, or she, I call her the alley coop. She held up just great. And kind of a perfect little system. She looks a little bit like a chrysalis. You're sort of in a pod or in a coffin. The system was pretty strong. I think the one issue I have with it is if the wind is big, you have to really make sure you're aiming into it because like the wind shifted on the beach when I was on the 90 Mile beach, and I had kind of a catastrophic blowdown. The whole thing came down on me. Fortunately, it wasn't raining at that point, so I just went outside and turned it and set it. But I do like tarp tent because of the system, and I also like the fact that it's not something you faff with very much. It's easy to set up. And there aren't like a million different things you have to, put to the ground and attach. And it's just like, boop, 4 things, just put your poles in and you're done. It takes about a minute.
How'd you like your backpack?
Love my backpack. Olive Oil is a Granite Gear made here in Minnesota. She's got great pockets and stuff. The one thing I didn't take, which I think I'm going to take on my next hike, I didn't take the lid because I just didn't feel like I needed it. It has so much space inside. It just has like a roll down top. You just roll it open, everything's in top. And I never seem to have a problem finding anything. But I think I'm going to give it a try to using the lid this time. That's like a sort of an extra organizational space. But, thru hikers get really paranoid about weight because you have to carry everything. So anything you say, I've got to have this, it's just one more piece of weight that goes on your back. But she was comfortable. I think the only thing that happens to me, too, is I get really skinny when I hike. And so I get rubbing on my hip bones. It doesn't leave any kind of like a blister or anything, but it turns my skin darker color. and I get like little bruises on my backbones too, because I'm bony. So I look kind of funny, but I don't know that there's anything you can really do about that. But yeah, the backpack was great. I use La Sportiva shoes. I have Akira's men's running shoes. That was like the best choice ever because you go through so much water, they just get wet and then they just dry fast. Boots take a long time to dry out, and even if they're waterproof, if you go in above the boot, the water just goes inside. And so you feel like you're walking in an aquarium. So they worked really well.
And you went through 2 pairs?
I went through 2 pairs. I probably should have done 3. I just took one for the North Island, one for the South Island. I would not necessarily recommend that. They were worn down to the nubs, but they didn't fall apart or anything. They never like ripped open. You couldn't see my toe or anything like that. But they almost had no grips on the bottom anymore. So I would suggest kind of the rule of thumb is about 1,000 kilometers or 700 miles, something like that per shoe. And I kind of went like 1,400 kilometers per shoe, almost 1,000 miles.
What's it like when you get to the end of, when you get down to Bluff?
Oh, well, it's a little bit anticlimactic because when you come out of Invercargill, you go through this really beautiful estuary and then you have a whole bunch of road walking. And, it's kind of a bummer because it's like, man, I've gone through all this beautiful stuff, but it's the only way to get there. I imagine at some point they'll have, permission from farmers and stuff to go overland, which would be really nice. I think it would make people happier. But what I really found interesting was at that point, I started seeing bicyclists coming up who had ridden the entire South Island. They're not on the Te Araroa. They're on roads, but they've ridden it and then they're going back. And so it was kind of neat to meet them. You got kind of excited because they were all like, they knew what you were doing. And several cars passed me and kind of honked and were like, give me sort of a, you go girl kind of sign, and I just had sort of a smile on my face the whole walk there. And it was a beautiful day. And you're coming around, you finally see the ocean and you can see Bluff out on the, there's a big hill above it. You see it as you're coming around a corner and you're just getting closer and closer to it. Sadly, they had a little bit of a dispute with the farmer, so there was a sort of a more beautiful way to arrive, to go around, counterclockwise around that bluff. But instead, I just went through town, and like the first thing I came upon was a place where they were serving bluff oysters, which are famous. They're some of the best in the world. And I just stopped. I was only, 5K from the end of my entire trail, and I was like, oh, wait, I'm going to sit down and have some oysters right now. And it was so delicious and so happy. And then I came into town and I just sort of took my time. And I'm really glad I did that because I'd made a friend in Invercargill. It's the larger town just one day away. He apparently thought to himself, I should go see her and just see how she did. And so he took time off work and he just drove down. For him, it's like a 20-minute drive. For me, it's a whole day. And I literally was coming over the rise and you suddenly see Sterling Point, which has one of those signs, that's pointing in a lot of directions, so many kilometers to Paris, so many kilometers to New York, that kind of thing. And I was looking at it and I was smiling and I just turned to my left and there was his car right there. And I was like, oh my gosh. And so I arrived alone. I hiked solo and I was hiking solo on the last day, but then my friend was there and it just made it great. It was so fun. And he took a million pictures and some guy came out and hoisted me up so I could hang off the sign. And that was just really cool. But I ended up spending the night there and then taking the ferry over to Stewart Island and hiking some more. I hadn't gotten enough. And so I hiked more on another island. Most people don't know that there's actually a third main island of New Zealand called Stewart Island.
You did the Northwest Circuit?
I didn't do the Northwest Circuit. I didn't have time. So I was a little disappointed that I wasn't able to do it, but I ran out of time because my husband was going to meet me in Christchurch, and I only had 5 days. So I did the Rakiura Great Walk, and then I did like 2 extra days kind of going out to Mason Bay and coming back. It was extraordinary. It was really, really beautiful and wild. I mean, I may never get back there, but it's something I'd love to go back and do. But there was these extraordinary views. I went up on a big mountaintop, and Mason Bay itself was this huge beach. You really felt wild down there because, here you are truly on the southernmost tip. I mean, in Bluff, you were in a town. Now you're really in wilderness. So that was very special. And actually, it was kind of cool to go on the Rakiura because that was a great walk. So a lot of people that were doing that were less experienced walkers, and it's not as hard. I mean, they were just, it's not very far. And yet there was a kind of a family atmosphere and, sort of a jovial kind of coming together. And it was just a completely different feeling than through hikers because that's not what they do. I mean, they're just more ordinary people. I mean, I guess I'm an ordinary person too, but, this was a very different thing for them to do. And it was fun. It was a really neat way to end it. I just met some really interesting people.
What would you say was the most challenging part of it, looking back?
Oh, like if you're just talking like physically challenging, like which part of the hike would you say was difficult? The Tararuas were dangerous and hard and scary. They were really muddy and really exposed. And then in the Nelson Lakes, I had some pretty serious weather move in. I ended up hiking with 6 other people over this one pass, and that made me feel safer. I think I would have been really scared to do that alone. And there'd been someone who in a previous year had disappeared there, and they had a sign asking people sort of in the avalanche zones, which in the summertime, it's just, a lot of rock fall. They said, if you see any fragments of clothing or bone, please report it. And I thought, oh my God, I mean, talk about fear. You're thinking, because this person's never been found. So, that's pretty terrifying. I would say those were hard because weather's really an issue, and the steepness, takes it out of you. I think that the river crossings are hard, but I think that really the hardest thing about doing the Te Araroa is kind of the emotions that get triggered in a place like that. It's challenging because the trail is not probably what it's going to be in 25 years. It's still being worked out, and some of it's not very good. It's not maintained. It's not clear. A lot of people don't know why you're there, what you're doing there, especially you experience out on the roads. I had some cars drive a little too close to me. And so you get a little bit of a feeling like, oh, what am I doing here? And you go through that kind of challenge. This is my first big through hike, so I don't know if that's something that happens on all of them, that you have, sort of the mental challenges. But it certainly had that. Yeah, I think I would answer it. I always like to give the positive side, though, the incredible generosity of people and the sense of wanting to make this thing happen, this long trail in their country. I mean, someone just decided, Jeffrey Chappell, came up with the idea and then saw his vision happening, that they connected other trails that existed and roads and sidewalks and throughways and, asked permission from private landowners to make this thing a phenomenon. And that's really, when you step back and think about it, it's pretty incredible.
If you could do something differently, if you were going to go back and do it again, what would you do differently?
I think that probably I would take a little more time to do it. Maybe take a few more side trips along the way, or I'd leave time to have done the 9-day Northwest Circuit, or do the whole thing. I mean, on Rakiura or Stewart Island, the Northwest and Southern Circuit takes about 10 days or 12 days. That would have been cool to add to the whole thing. But if I took a little more time, I probably could have seen more. But on the other hand, I did a lot of side trips. I mean, I climbed Mount Taranaki for New Year's morning. That was extraordinary. That's not on the trail. It's really far off the trail. But it was just this kind of serendipitous thing. I met someone and we went. And it was incredible because we were the first to summit. We were there for the sunrise. And that was glorious. I went to Abel Tasman with a friend who lives in Nelson, who's actually from Minnesota, interestingly enough. And that was just amazing. It was so special. And again, that's completely off the trail. It's in a different direction. And then I had the experiences when my husband came. That was pretty special, where we did a couple of great walks. So, having that time, maybe I would do that differently. I don't know. I think I did it perfectly. Complaints and all. I tend to bitch a little bit, but but then I look back and I go, oh, it wasn't that bad.
Do you have any advice for people, or can you recommend any resources for people that are trying to plan for the Te Araroa?
Yeah, I would definitely download the Guthook app. Some people balk at the price. I think it's like $30. It's a crowdsourced app. I think it's completely worth it. And, it helps them keep the whole system floating. Not everything needs to be free. I think it's fair. I liked, the notes are really helpful from the Te Araroa Association. Sometimes they're a little bit confusing. So it's always good to, to follow other people's blogs. The problem with my blog is my blog tends to be for non-hikers. It tends to be a little bit more about my own emotions, my own feelings about what I did, and kind of my own journey, which is more a storyline of, the journey of the soul rather than hard and fast advice. But I followed Walking with Wired, and I thought she was great. She hiked it in like 2016. So a lot of the information's changed. The trail's going in different places now. But it's sometimes helpful to just kind of look up another blogger who's written every day. And that's kind of key. You don't want to get like a general feel. You want to get like people's strategies each day. I think that if you were to hike it and you went to mine, you might see, like if you felt that you could go my pace, because I actually went pretty fast, surprisingly, for my age, but you could see the places I stayed. And that's really helpful because when you start to see where people stay and you kind of line it up, you can put that into your map and into your planning. But again, the Te Araroa has all the, the phone numbers and the contacts of all like the places to resupply, the restaurants, the, different places to camp and the outfitters. So it's really useful.
In certain places, there's trail angels. Are you able to somehow call those people?
Yeah. Oh, so I got a SIM card while I was there. So I had a phone number and the trail angels. Oh, so Facebook is a really good resource. Sometimes the Facebook page got a little bit over the top. There's a lot of people who are very, very inexperienced and they just keep asking, like a lot of people ask the same questions and it just gets a little old. And then there's sometimes there's a lot of kind of like scare, like people get you really nervous about stuff and it's over the top. But Facebook is always a great way to, to find people. Trail Angels, it would be the Te Araroa Trail Angels, has its own page. But the Facebook page for Te Araroa, and I was on the 2018, class of 1819 or something like that, I think is what it's called. You probably want to go in your group. Some of them, they really want to be known. And I just kind of found, like in Twizel, I found someone there who has a hobbit house and she just makes it available. And a lot of people skip Twizel because they just ride their bike through. But I really wanted to stop there and it was so cool. I slept in a hobbit house. And she was amazing. And they were just lovely people. And she just puts her information up on Facebook. It's a monitored site. They try to keep the crazies off and the trolls off. I mean, it's a private. You have to join the group. But, they let my husband join. He's not hiking it, but, someone who wants to, he's not a crazy or a troll. No, but I mean, he's someone who wants to just kind of follow along. And, and I think that's a really good resource. The whole Trail Angel thing is really low key right now because I think people don't know about the trail that much. It's still in its kind of, nascent stage, but they're out there. And, my friends in Whanganui were like some of the most amazing people I've known in my life, Rob and George. And they take pleasure and pride and joy in inviting us off the trail and following our lives. And it's pretty amazing. And they also told me over and over, if you get in trouble and you need help, call us. And there was actually a woman who fell and was injured, and she came and stayed with them for like weeks. I mean, I think it even turned into months because she was seriously injured, and her husband like continued the trail, and she waited for him there.
Alison, what is next for you?
Well, sadly, when I came back to Minnesota, my company decided to lay me off, and it wasn't expected, and it's left me a little bit frazzled and ungrounded. So I've decided to use this time between careers to try another trail. So I bought a one-way ticket, and I know I can come back. I can stop the trail. I don't have any plan to necessarily finish it, but if I finish it, why not? Now's a great time. So I'm going to walk the Pacific Crest Trail, which is a major through trail, premier trail of the world. It's in Washington, Oregon and California in the United States. And it's late in the year, but this is the time that people start from Washington. So I'm going to fly to Seattle actually Saturday and go up with 20 strangers up to Hart's Pass. And what you have to do, because you can't enter from Canada, you have to hike up to Canada, touch the top, and then you start hiking south. So I'm going to go try it and see what happens. And I hope you'll follow me at blissfulhiker.com. I'll be writing every day and, putting up thoughts of the trail. And maybe I'll do, a week. Maybe I'll do 5 months. I don't know. We'll see.
How much of the gear that you used on Araroa are you taking to PCT?
I got 4 new pairs of shoes. Actually, I should say that La Sportiva sponsored me. So I'm really, really lucky and I'm super grateful to them. So I have a couple of new things, but it's a lot of the same stuff. The one thing that I have to focus on for Washington is snow gear. So I have an ice axe and crampons, a little bit warmer clothes. I have a liner to sleep in that I'll just put my quilt over, a few like Capeline long underwear and stuff like that, because the weather could be cold and the weather could also be pretty wet in the north. But also there are these big snow fields and they're super steep. So you really need an ice axe and crampons.
Well, I'm excited for you. It should be really fun.
It sounds a little crazy, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Good thing my husband has a job.
Oh, man. Well, yeah, that's I guess it's a risk you take when you take a leave of absence. You never know what's going to happen.
Yeah, it's a risk you take, but you only live once. And, what's life without living it big?
Exactly. Okay, Alison Young, thank you so much for coming on the show again. Appreciate it. And for fitting me into your busy, hectic schedule before you are heading off for the PCT on Saturday. And hey, good luck out there. We will follow along with you at blissfulhiker.com and wish you the best of luck.
Thanks so much, Paul. This has been a gas.
Thank you for listening. You can find this episode online at thepursuitzone.com/TPZ176. That's TPZ176. And if you enjoyed hearing about Araroa, you might also want to check out episode 97 that I did with Anna McNuff. You can find that at thepursuitzone.com/TPZ097. Be sure to subscribe to the show. Head over to thepursuitzone.com. You can find some subscription links. And like the show on Facebook. You can also follow along on Twitter. Those tags are at The Pursuit Zone. Hey, if you want to send me some feedback, you can do so at paul@thepursuitzone.com. You can also leave a voice message at speakpipe.com/thepursuitzone. This episode was recorded on 6/25/2019. For the show notes and more great adventure travel podcasts, visit thepursuitzone.com.